Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cozy Corner Chronicles. This is our second official episode, but I'm Julia,
And I'm Liz.
and we are your hosts for this podcast. And we have video now, so you'll be seeing us in 720p. Sorry, no 1080p here, but you'll be seeing us and all of our awkward mannerisms while we talk. For instance, I'm holding this
Yeah.
microphone instead of setting it down like a normal person. But
Just
as
making it harder for
promised,
yourself.
I know, arm workout. I skipped arm day, but as promised, in our last episode, we told you guys that we were reading The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, and it's been a week, and we have now finished the book, and we are ready to deep dive into it.
Yeah, and when I tell you this book took us on a roller coaster of emotions and just a roller coaster in general, it really, really did.
Absolutely. So, just to start off with, just a little thing about reminders is that we do go very in depth into the book. So, if you have not read the book yet or you don't want spoilers, you might want to just skip the podcast for now or skip this episode and then come back to it when you've read the book. But, content warning wise, we do want to give this trigger warning for anybody in case this is not something you want to hear or listen to. We
Mhm.
want to make sure you guys have your mental health in check. So, content warning wise, we're warning you that this novel includes discussion of racism, anti Semitism, xenophobia, ableism, involuntary institutionalization, child essay, and substance misuse as well. Okay. So we totally get it if you guys want to skip this episode and come back for another. And we appreciate you guys just supporting in spirit.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and jump straight into the background of the story. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a mass migration from Eastern Europe to the United States, which led to the settlement of many Jewish immigrants in Philadelphia. And then by the late 1880s, the city had a distinct Jewish quarter in Society Hill and Queen Village. Most of these immigrants found work in sweatshops, markets, and obviously a central attraction for them were the synagogues. Four of those original ones still remain today. Um, and our story today, or the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store novel, it incorporates a lot of the Jewish community's activism, including the Jewish Union Railroad workers who helped Dodo and Nate escape Penthurst. And these characters face like xenophobia and anti Semitism while also trying to create new lives and communities in Pennsylvania.
Yes, and the reason we're giving you guys background on this story is because right off the bat, there is a lot of references that James McBride makes to Jewish communities. So a lot of terms
Mm-hmm.
come from the Jewish community that we both had to research because we were just kind of confused. So that's what we're giving you the background. That way you guys know if we reference something, and that way you guys know.
Yeah, because we definitely did not. And I had to look up a lot of things. I even had to text Julia on the side and be like, wait, did you understand this part? Because I was confused.
No, I was the same. And I think overall, of course, we want to try to save discussion for when we actually do the podcast, but it's kind of inevitable that we're texting each other on the side, like, oh my gosh, what's going on? So,
Literally.
yeah, this book was very different. I think we had just
Hmm.
discussed too. It's not something that I think we typically read, but
Hmm.
I think it's very much worth the read. In the beginning, like first 11 or 12 chapters, James McBride kind of does a really intense kind of world building. I don't want to say world building in a sense, but he does a lot of character introduction. So you're meeting
Right.
people back to back to back, and the story may not actually develop the storyline until the second half of the book.
Which was confusing for me because I've never read a book like this where we get the front load of all the characters, even if they don't necessarily mean anything until like chapter 20, chapter 16. And it wasn't just him introducing like the main characters, it was introducing every single
Mhm.
person in the book. And I think it kind of took me by surprise because in the beginning I didn't really feel like there was, like you were saying, like I didn't really feel like there was a storyline to be following. So it like piqued my interest in and out just because I really wanted to get through the characters so that I could see what the storyline would be about. Because when he opened up with the finding the skeleton and the mezuzah and everything, I was like, oh snap, like this is about to be super intense, like, you know, all this stuff. And then we kind of deteriorated away from that and went straight into character building.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think in the beginning, like just off the first chapter, you get introduced to a character, and then 20 chapters later, or 24, however many this book has, I had like already forgotten that that was the character that was mentioned, because he's not really even like, Malachi isn't really even a main character in a sense. He's just kind
Yeah,
of a
agreed.
side character, but they started off with Malachi. So it was, that was just interesting.
Yeah. So it was unique to say the least. But we can go ahead and jump into just maybe some chapter summaries, and then we can go over, just what we felt about the book overall, and go from there.
Yes. So, starting with chapter one, like we had kind of mentioned, the chapter is called The Hurricane. So, just a
Mhm.
little bit about chapter one is that in June of 1972, state troopers discovered a skeleton in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, which we were talking about, along with a mezuzah. And authorities consult the last remaining member of the Chicken Hill neighborhood's Jewish community, which is Malachi. The
Mhm.
mezuzah specifically has a Hebrew inscription that reads, "Home of the greatest dancer in the world," which we will kind of talk about that reference when we get to it later. But Malachi
Mhm.
used to, of course, be known for his dancing before he gave it up 40 years ago. The troopers plan to revisit Malachi after gathering more evidence, but the next day, ironically, Hurricane Agnes
Literally.
literally, destroys the entire crime scene. And Chicken Hill's black residents view it as a divine justice because it actually shelters Malachi while avenging Miss Chona and Dodo. And so
Mhm.
when the troopers finally return to Malachi's house, he is nowhere to be found and he has now escaped. So
Mhm.
I think just already going off chapter one, I think James McBride did a really good job of just intriguing you from the first chapter. Like, it,
Mhm.
and it didn't really give anything away. Like, had when I was just reading the first chapter, I was like, oh, we're about to get into a murder mystery. Like, we're gonna solve this murder right off the bat,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I
Mhm.
don't know what your thoughts were, but that was what my first
No,
impression
definitely.
was. So yeah, we're on the same page there. Like, it kind of tells you, and not really tells you, it basically kind of alludes to the fact that there's a murder, which of course the
Mhm.
summary of the whole book also tells you that, but it's very unique how he kind of ties everything together in the end as well.
Right. And then for chapter two, we go 47 years into the past and we meet Moshe, who at this point is 21, and he owns this dance hall and theater. And he's basically trying to, like, he's basically saying, how can I increase my income? Right? I mean, that's that was his whole thing, is how can I be rich? And so he starts advertising to bring this clarinet player named Mickey Katz. And so it brings a bunch of people in, even though everything was going crazy, like with advertisements running wrong and like all that stuff. Like, he still had so many people come to this event. And then he ends up meeting a man who ends up being Malachi, but he doesn't know. He ends up meeting a man outside, and he's like, I'm gonna dance with every person here, and I'm just gonna wing it and find a wife. And Moshe's like, what do you mean? Like, how can you find a wife if you're gonna dance with every single person? And then they never get past that discussion because there was an explosion literally outside when Malachi was trying to catch the train or the bus, one of the two. Um, so Later, like, it goes back in time some more, and Moshe, he confides in Rabbi Yakov Flor. I am so sorry if I just totally butchered that name. But he is the owner of the Heaven and Earth grocery store. And so the rabbi ends up inviting Moshe to come over and to read some scriptures and talk about it, and, get all of this through. To which he ends up meeting Chona, and Chona is the rabbi's daughter, who also is a polio survivor. And she ends up teaching Moshe about Moses, and then he falls in love with her, asks her to marry him, and she says yes, and they get married.
Yes. So I think it's important to note that in the first two chapters, they kind of introduce you to, I don't know if, okay, I don't want to say Malachi's not the most important, but for sure Moshe and Chona are going to be one of the most important people that you actually need to know in the novel. And
Mm-hmm.
it's also important to know, I don't like, in my mind this wasn't clicking for me when I had first read it, but it's important to note as well that Moshe and Chona are from like the white community, so they are not
Right.
African American, they are white in
Mm-hmm.
this sense, and that will become later that will be very important for how they interact with
Mm-hmm.
different characters that, of course, come in the book.
Yep, definitely agree.
And so then we move on to chapter 3, which is called 12. So we get more background on Chona now, who is very prevalent, of course. She's a Pottstown native, and this is the chapter where she convinces Moshe, who is now, of course, her husband, to open the theater to Black patrons, despite the
Mm-hmm.
anger of white people in the white community. So Moshe, of course, agrees, and he ends up hosting a performance by Chick Webb, which draws a lot of Black patrons. And he basically finds that this completely transforms his theater, and the crowd loves it. So he
Yep.
also begins having dreams about Moses and the number 12, but he keeps it a secret from Chona because of the fact that he doesn't really want to have the superstitions of like the Romanian background that he's from.
Mm-hmm.
But because he's so inspired by the number 12, he ends up investing in 12 stocks, brings like 12 different Black bands to the theater, which basically leads him to financial growth, which is really good for him. But of course, because racism and everything, he gets a lot of backlash from jealousy, anti-Semitism, all of that stuff. But he and his wealthy cousin Isaac, who does not live in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, pay off all of their detractors and everything like that as well. So as he is kind of climbing up the ranks in the sense of this community, he ends up buying the Heaven Earth grocery store with the intent to actually sell it later. So when Jewish people are moving out of Chicken Hill, he wants to sell it. But
Mm-hmm.
when he has that conversation with Chona, she refuses, and then they end up getting in a pretty heated discussion. And then he, in a sense, makes fun of Chona. I wouldn't say makes fun of, but when you're angry and you say things that you don't mean, he
Mm-hmm.
basically refers to Chick Webb, which is the first Black performer that he had in his theater, as a cripple, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes Chona super upset, as it would anybody else if you're already insecure about something that was a part of you that you can't control. But
And she has a limp too, right?
yeah, she does have a
Yeah.
limp. She has like that special shoe that makes it, I
Yep.
think, a little
Yep.
better.
Mm-hmm.
But Chona, of course, is super upset, and then he makes amends with her by giving her a Jewish law book 12 years into their marriage. And then this now also, the sad thing is, tells you that in 1936, Chona actually develops a persistent cough, stomach pain, fainting spells, which basically means that, she's sick now. But they have a
Mm-hmm.
local physician named Doc Roberts, but he is a member of the KKK. So because Chona very much cherishes the Black community and her childhood best friend who was also Black, she's like, no, I'm not going to see him, which rightfully so. Stick it to the man. I agree, sister. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, when Chona, her condition worsens, cousin Isaac suggests that maybe Moshe should place her in a Jewish home for the sick in Philadelphia where he lives. But Moshe is like, no, we're not going to do that because Chona's going to be fine. She's going to recover, stay here, and be in her community.
Mm-hmm. I feel like this chapter I think was really needed. Don't get me wrong, like we were saying, like it's a lot of character building in the beginning, but I really do think that we needed the background on Chona just because it really, really shows later in the story like how much all of this builds up to the character she really does become.
I agree. And I also think that it's important because it showcases already that Chona and Moshe are different. Like they're not
Mm-hmm.
your typical, like they don't basically, it's kind of a touchy subject to talk about because of course this book really focuses on racism and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it also just shows that in a community where racism is very, very prevalent, Chona is not afraid to stick up for those who don't have a voice, or she's not afraid to mingle despite what society says at that time.
Right.
So
Um, yeah, definitely agree. So chapter 4 is called Dodo. We meet Addie Timlin, and she's a Black woman who works at the Heaven and Earth grocery store, and she has a husband named Nate who also works with Moshe at the theater. Her husband is in an association with other Black men, and they plan on meeting at Addie's house to just discuss ways to improve opportunities and utilities for Chicken Hill's Black community. Addie says that they really just meet to just gossip and play cards the entire time. Well, while they were there and while she was still waiting for Nate, their conversation kind of turned back to Chona, and Addie like freaks out. She ends up confronting a man named Reverend Snooks Briggs for harboring some anti-Semitic ideas about Chona. Then finally, Nate gets home, and Addie tells him about their nephew Dodo, and Dodo was spotted hanging around like on the train and stuff, headed for Philadelphia when he was supposed to be at school. And so we find out that Dodo is deaf because of a stove explosion. His mother's exploded. Um, and then Nate ends up finding Dodo, and Dodo's like super sad, like all this stuff. And then he hands Nate a piece of paper, and basically it says like his mom is dead and he needs to leave. Um, this this chapter kind of shocked me because, again, meeting all the characters, like all this stuff, we're now front loaded with the fact that Dodo is deaf. He just lost his mother. Like, where's he gonna go? He's 12. Like, there was a lot in that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the way that James McBride introduces the characters, you wouldn't think that Dodo is somebody that is going to be super important. But
Mm-hmm.
as we kind of continue going through this, you'll see that I think Dodo arguably is maybe the most important character in this novel. But yeah, I agree with you. It was just a lot of front loading. Like, as you can tell, as we're kind of discussing the summaries that we've written and, stuff like that, is that there's not really a storyline here. We're just kind of telling you about characters and their backgrounds right now.
Which is crazy because you
Right.
would think that, we're on chapter 5, we'll have a storyline by this point, but we don't. Again, we're getting the same information as you guys. We're just getting all the information about the characters.
Yes. And so the same thing happens in chapter 5 in a sense. Of course, they bring back an old character, but
Mhm.
you kind of don't like, you kind of know, but of course, Moshe doesn't know. So chapter 5 is called The Stranger. And this is a chapter where a Jewish man visits Moshe at his grocery store. And this character, of course, there were rumors about him going on in the chapter, but he was somebody who recently bought a bakery and needs kosher flour to make challah. I probably also butchered that. I'm so sorry. Please, if you guys know how to pronounce things better than we do, please always feel free to let us know, because pronunciation,
That's why I try to listen to the audiobook.
I know,
So I'm
because
like,
you're like,
okay, I
"Ah."
can.
Right?
But
Like,
I think you're right, Chala.
I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm really bad at pronouncing things already as it is. So, but yes, he needs kosher flour. And Moshe tries to shut him down because he's too worried about Chona. Like, Chona is still at this point going in and out of sickness and she's not doing well. But as Moshe is trying to shut him out, literally trying to slam the door in this guy's face, this man is like just too strong. And so
Mhm.
he randomly tells Moshe, I found a wife. And the guy, like, Moshe is like, okay,
Who
why do I care
cares?
if you
Yeah.
found a wife? My wife is
I
sick, bro.
don't care.
Right? He's like, what? And so then he's like, no, like, I'm Malachi. And like, Moshe still doesn't recognize him at this point. And I don't think it
Mhm.
hits him until finally he's like, oh, you're the guy who's at the dance hall when Mickey Katz was playing. And then he's like, oh my gosh, like, they start talking or whatever. But he basically is like, oh, hey, I remember we heard that explosion and you said that it was going to be a bad time. Like, and Malachi was like, nah, those times have ended now. So you're like, okay, finally we're seeing a character come back, but what does that mean?
Right. There was no like there what was the point of that, you know?
Right. And
And I feel like they oh, I'm sorry.
no, 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 you go.
I feel like they keep at this point they kept reiterating the explosion, the explosion, the explosion, and then still at this point I hadn't put it together that it was Dodo and the explosion, even
Yes.
though they had mentioned it multiple times.
Yes, like, I think when I was reading it too, I was the same as you. In my mind, I I thought that the explosion had something to do with the dead man. Like, I thought that's what it was
Mhm.
going to be, was that maybe it was a gun or something, but in my mind I was the same. I didn't think that it had anything to do with the stove that exploded causing, some stuff with Dodo.
Yeah. And then we go into chapter 6, which is called Chala. So 2 days after Malachi came to the bakery, Chona started to feel a lot better. She didn't have a fever anymore. Her health was getting a lot better. And then Moshe was like, oh, it's definitely because Malachi was bringing Chona the bread. But then I'm like, but Chona never ate the bread. So how did you attribute those two things together?
I
That
thought the
just didn't
same
really
thing.
make sense to me. I was really confused about that. Um, and not to mention, he didn't give it to Chona because he tasted it and it tasted awful. So I don't get how that really. Anyways,
The correlation.
um, yes. So Malachi was not a good baker, and but he was very charming. Like he was enthusiastic, like all that stuff. So they became really like close friends and really fast, and they shared their experiences together. However, it was always surface level. Like no matter how close they got, it never broke surface level. um Moshe also ended up giving Malachi a mezuzah, which had the inscription "Home of the greatest dancer in the world," and he wanted him to give it to Chona. um but he never, like, they never said anything more about that. Malachi also ends up seeing Dodo work at the theater and wonder why, like, Dodo was never at school. And I think at this point we also learned that because Dodo was hard of hearing and all of that, like he stopped going to school because he didn't want to. Um, and then Malachi felt super troubled by the way Black people were getting treated in America, and he ends up wanting to leave and asks Moshe to sell his bakery for him. And then they don't see each other for a couple of years.
And I thought that was so random. Like, Malachi comes in, bakes bread, I guess. It's not good bread. Chona suddenly gets better, and then he's like, nah, dude, like, I'm out.
I'm
I
out. Yeah, that was so random.
And honestly speaking, I kind of thought that Malachi's character was supposed to be like a symbol of hope, because I noticed that whenever he came in, good things happened. Then when
Mm-hmm.
he left, bad things happened. So
Mm.
I was like, are you supposed to be a symbol of something here? Or are you just like a character that, you know?
See, that's so funny that you say that because I didn't see him in that way, but I definitely could understand how. I saw him kind of as like the comedic relief.
Mm.
Like because the book was so heavy and I think it talked about a lot of heavy things, like Malachi, every time Malachi was brought into the situation or brought back to the story, it was always something funny. Like the bread being terrible, like being the world's greatest dancer, like that wasn't funny, but that was still like something different than the heavy topics that were discussed in the book.
See, now that you mentioned that, I'm like, that makes so much more sense. Like, I could see him as that too, because, yeah, the way that, he was like, nah, I'm gonna get a wife, but I'm gonna also just like riz up every single girl in this in this theater right now. You know? Like, so
Literally.
I think I kind of like your viewpoint better, because it's true. Like, Malachi isn't a main character in this story, but he plays an important role in a weird, ironic way.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it also just like even the pants thing.
Yeah.
Like that was so random,
Yeah.
like, but I feel like it was supposed to provide some comedic
Like
relief.
happiness too, and just,
Mhm.
I like that. Okay, look at us, not English majors, but we dissecting the book.
We try our best.
I know. So, in chapter 7, it's called A New Problem. So, this is a month after Malachi's sudden disappearance. Moshe is basically, he's still thinking about the criticism that Malachi said about America. And this is also the same chapter where you find out that Nate is asking Moshe if basically they can hide Dodo, who is his nephew, like we had mentioned, at the theater,
Mhm.
because Dodo is now being, I don't want to say hunted down, but he's basically being hunted down by the state government, who is threatening to take Dodo to a special school in Spring City, which
Mhm.
is, of course, outside of Pottstown, Pennsylvania. But his family doesn't want him institutionalized, because they basically tell you that yes, it's a school for special people, but really it's like almost like an insane asylum.
Yeah.
So sad. But the idea of interfering in a government matter really terrifies Moshe. Like, he doesn't have the same mindset that Chona has, where she's fearless even dealing with the government. Moshe is actually very scared. But because Addie, who is Nate's wife once again, cared for Chona throughout her sickness, was always there, even like worked at the grocery store and everything. He's like, okay, I will I will let Dodo stay in the basement of the theater. But when Moshe goes home and tells Chona that, she's like so pissed. She's like, why are you letting a child alone in the dark basement with like barely any heat, a little tiny stove? So she's like, no, you're bringing Dodo home to me like right now.
Yeah, and I thought that was like, first of all, Moshe is a scaredy cat. That's the first thing. Like, how do you sit around here and say that you run all the theaters and run the town and you have all this money and all this stuff, but your your wife is more of an activist than you are. All these people of all
Period.
different backgrounds are bringing you in all this money, and you're scared of who and why.
I know.
And
And
that
sorry, no,
was
you
just weird to
go.
me.
Like, no,
No, go ahead.
I agree though, because I was like, your wife is the biggest activist ever. And not only that, because she even advocated for you to open up your theater in the first place, that's how you basically made your fortune. Like,
Yes.
so how are you not, like you gotta stick it to the man sometimes. And I think that was a very important, I guess, topic in terms of the book too, is like Chona was not afraid of anything, and she was not afraid to be herself, hang out with who she wanted to be, open her doors to whoever she opened her doors to, whereas Moshe was very like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm so scared, like someone help me, like. And
Literally, yes.
yeah, Jonah had more balls than he did. I think we can agree there.
Yeah, definitely. And then, yet again, we meet another character in chapter 8. This one's called Paper. Um, so every Saturday, Chick in the Hills, colored maids, housekeepers, saloon cleaners, factory workers, and bellhops, they all gather at the Heaven and Earth grocery store to hear the latest gossip from this lady named Patty Million, but they call her Paper. So she's literally like a live newspaper. um, at this point, Chona is still hiding Dodo to avoid him going to the super scary asylum. But Paper knows like not to say anything about this. Instead, she tells a story about a guy named Enzo. They call him Big Soap, and he knocked out another guy's name, or another guy, and his name is Fatty Davis. He knocks out his gold tooth, and so pretty much they're just going on and gossiping about this story, and then Paper ends up seeing uh, a unfamiliar face in the crowd, and she suspects that it's the state, who obviously is going after Chona at the moment because there are rumors going around that she is harboring Dodo. um so that was that. And then Addie doesn't tell Chona about the new person that they see in the crowd because they don't want any more trouble with anybody else. And then Paper volunteers to find out who told the government about where Dodo was because someone is snitching.
Mm-hmm. And I think kind of now with the introduction of Paper, you kind of think there's like, okay, yeah, now we're gonna kind of get a storyline. Like that's what you think, right? Because you're like, okay, we've now seen Dodo. There's like, okay, Dodo's being harbored by someone.
Hmm.
Government officials after Dodo. You're like, okay, yeah, like we're gonna get a storyline. But
Wrong.
yeah, but
more
wrong because
more character.
yeah, because
More
now
character development.
exactly, because now in chapter 9 you get introduced, the chapter is called The Robin and the Sparrow. You get introduced to Bernice Davis, which is the childhood best friend that we had
Hmm.
mentioned in chapter 3 with Chona's background. So Bernice Davis, a close friend of Chona, which technically I guess now they're not really close, but
Yeah, they're
she
not.
right, she lives next door to the Heaven and Earth grocery store. They were once best friends, but they hadn't spoken in years. But Bernice's father Shad and Chona's father Yaakov were really close when they were young.
Hmm.
So Yaakov, of course, is the rabbi that Chona's father is, and he's a Bulgarian immigrant and saved enough money to basically build the grocery store and a shul in Pottstown. However, 17 Jewish families were prevented from settling due to the intimidation, which we, I think, now know is a common theme, along
Hmm.
with clever laws and just outright thievery. And then, unfortunately, Shad died soon after the shoal's construction, and then his life savings were stolen by a financial advisor. So,
Hmm.
sad, but Chona's mother ensured that Shad's widow had enough food for her family. So basically, at this point, like they were also really close because their dads were close, and then he basically was going to provide for the family. And I think it's important to note here that once again, Bernice is of black descent and Chona is of white descent. So this was like a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because of everything that's happening, Chona and Bernice became super quick best friends in their first grade together. And it lasted until high school when, which we've seen, because of the unfair treatment of Bernice when they're having a sewing project where basically they did the same stitch, like Chona did the same stitch for both her dress and Bernice's dress, but the high school teacher only called out Bernice and was like, this is not a stitch you should use. And then Bernice was like, you set me up for failure. And then basically was like, yeah, sorry, you're done. You're not in my life. Cut. So then they stopped
Yeah.
talking. And then,
I ooh,
no, you go. What were you going to say?
I didn't really understand like I didn't really understand why like she just like not fell off the face of the earth with Chona, but why there wasn't a conversation that happened between the both of them because I feel like it could have been a good learning moment for Chona as well, just to see the like the differences and the inequalities between two, but like the fact that she just cut her off, I was like, ooh.
I literally felt the same. I was like, wait, we're not going to have like a conversation. But
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think that maybe the conversation didn't happen because Bernice was like, you're not going to get it. Like, we just come from two
Mm-hmm.
different worlds. And even if we have the conversation, like, you wouldn't understand. That's kind of how I felt. But then I still think they should have had the conversation because if they were besties, like, you owe it to each other to at least just talk it out.
Right.
But
Hmm.
then, of course, now we're brought back to the present where Dodo, we're mentioning him a bunch, so ding, 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 he's important. But a boy she sees as a child, she spent years praying for. So that's how Chona views Dodo. And you kind of get that background of why Chona is doing all this to protect Dodo. And so
Mm-hmm.
at this point, Dodo has been staying with Moshe and Chona for 4 months, but Chona fears now that the government is going to come and take Dodo because it seems like someone is, snitching on the fact that Chona is harboring her. So because of this, Chona kind of reaches out to Bernice and is like, hey, can I place Dodo in your front yard when the government comes? Because Bernice has a ton of children. Like that's what everyone knows her as. I think everyone was like, last time we
Mm-hmm.
spoke, she has 8 children and maybe more. So because of that, if Dodo gets sent in the front yard of Bernice, the government won't know the difference is their mindset. And so
Mm-hmm.
Bernice does it, but before Chona can be like, "Hey, thank you," she's like, eat her," like doors
Yeah, she
closed
was
in
like,
your face.
bye.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that was like, "Oh, okay, dang." You think it's
And they
recently?
never, yeah, and they never like fixed their friendship like the whole
Never.
entire time. And I thought that maybe Dodo was the one that was going to bring them together because they were harboring him together. But no, nothing.
Yep, I was also shook. I was like, "Oh, never mind. No reconciliation for you."
Literally. So then we go to chapter 10, which is called The Scrub Shoe. Um, we have already met Doc Roberts briefly, and it wasn't like anything in depth, but again, another character to meet. But there's a doctor that goes, his name is Earl Roberts, but he goes by Doc Roberts. He also survived polio and developed a limp, just like Chona. Um, there is a shoemaker in the town, and his name is Norman Skrumpskillis. I hope I said that right. If not, you know. Anyways, Doc Roberts does not like this man at all. Um, Doc Roberts also ends up ha- getting a crush on Chona, like when they were in school. And I was trying to follow along with this one, and this one was kind of hard because it didn't say like, oh, rewinding time again. Like it just kind of like jumped straight into it. So from what I perceived of it, he developed a crush on Chona when he was in school. Who Chona was a year younger than Doc Roberts, and he invites her like out and asks her to join this debate club, and she's like, ah, nah, I'm good.
Yeah, she's like, "Eat
And yeah, and he was like, excuse me, I've never been rejected before, and I don't like this. And so it really intensified his anti Semitism. So then Doc Roberts ends up studying medicine at Penn State and returns to Pottstown, which has now become, in his eyes, a town of immigrants. He marries a farm girl and has 4 children, and then ends up falling out of love with her. He joins the KKK, and then he thinks he's spreading his Christian values through the KKK. He also is ends up being one of the leaders, which is why Chona in the beginning just refused to go and see him to get treated at all. Um, Doc Roberts, being very petty and messy, learns that Chona is sheltering Dodo. And so he's like, oh, interesting. Because his cousin, Carl Boydkins, is the person who works for the state government who's coming to get Dodo. So
Ironic.
Doc Roberts is like, interesting. Interesting that you would harbor him, Chona.
True.
And so and so uh Carl offers to pay Doc Roberts to examine Dodo, as a doctor would need to be able to transfer him to Penhurst State School and Hospital. And then Doc Roberts is like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll go investigate Chona and give a little look at Dodo. And then, but he tried to tell his cousin like not to involve the police. And then this really made me think Doc Roberts is a sneaky butthole.
We're explicit now, so
Oh, he's an asswipe.
yeah, he
Like,
is.
that chapter alone made me like extremely hate him. You're mad at Chona because she rejected
Mm.
you years ago. You are married. You have 4 kids. Get over it.
And I think, like, when you see someone spiral, like, I hate to bring an anime reference into this right now, but I recently watched JJK, and like seeing how people spiral, I was like looking at this man, not looking, I was reading it, and I was like, he can't be serious right now.
Literally, the amount of times he made my jaw drop, I was just like, dude, are you for real?
And oh god, like I get it. Like every story needs a villain, but
Oh, but he's
he
the
is the
worst
villain.
villain.
Yeah, like he is the
Yeah.
villain in so many ways, like so many. Oh god, he makes my blood boil. And we'll get into
Mhm.
that later, of course, because of course more things happen. But so the last chapter in part 1 is chapter 11. It's called Gone. And this is where things start to pick up. Like suddenly, you got
Yes.
10 chapters of character introduction, and now the storyline is starting to be there. So
Yeah.
in this chapter, Dodo witnesses a really heated argument between Chona and Doc Roberts at the grocery store. And Chona reveals, of course, that she's American. And then during this heated argument with about their values, how it differs, and how Chona's confronting him about all that stuff, basically saying, I'm an American, you're an American, our values are just different. Dodo
Mhm.
witnesses her fall, which if you recall, she has fainting spells, and now she has seizures. So fearing that Doc Roberts will basically do something, he at first is like, okay, I'm gonna hide. But then when she starts to fall and sees, and then Doc Roberts does an awful thing, which is now getting into our first trigger warning of essay. He literally just starts touching her, like as she's
Mhm.
unconscious and as she's falling. And before he can do more than, just groping her everywhere, Dodo, of course, jumps out from his basement and socks Doc Roberts like right in the face. And because of this, everything goes down really quick. But Addie, of course, helps Chona, who is having now a second seizure after she had just gone over her first one. And then Doc immediately runs out and calls a bunch of police officers, 3 specifically. And as they're basically chasing Dodo around, Dodo's like, all right, I'm going to climb on top of this roof, and then I'm just going to jump and then go run to, like, I think the train is what he was aiming for. But literally, as he's jumping, a police officer grabs him by the collar, and then he ends up falling. And I think we had talked about this. He falls, and then the book is like silent forever. So you're like,
Yes.
right? You're like, this man is dead. No, he is not dead, guys. Spoiler, he is not dead. So
Not dead.
yeah, so he just gets severely injured. So that ends part 1 of the book, which contains 11 chapters. And so, as you guys can kind of see and hear, I guess you can't see, as you guys can hear, there is a bunch of character development. You get introduced to almost everyone in depth. Later on, they do a little more character introduction for people who are mentioned, but you kind of hear about everyone, and now this is where the storyline is officially going to start.
I remember reading chapter 11 and immediately texting you. Like
Hmm.
I know like we try to keep our sidebar conversations to like a minimal and like all this stuff, but I was in extreme shock. Like I first of all, the stuff with Doc Roberts just escalated so quickly. Like I already knew I hated the guy even more. Like what is going on with you? Why are you doing that? This woman is
Hmm.
literally unconscious having a seizure on the floor and this is what you decide to do as a doctor? And then I was just I was unnerved because like I get where Dodo was coming from because he wanted to help earlier. And I remember they
Hmm.
said that he was like sitting under the thing and he was like
Yep.
hiding, covering his mouth, trying not to scream, even though he saw those things happening. And he was like, F it, I'm gonna jump over the counter and just knock this dude out. And then like it it just unfolded all so quickly. But then I'm like, okay, so we're over the character building. Now we're starting the story because where did this come from?
Yeah, it was definitely a 0 to 100 moment. Like there was so many things going on in this, but I think James McBride, there we go, did a very good job of being like, all right, see, you see how crappy of a person Doc Roberts is in chapter 10? Well, let me tell you how crappy of a person he is now in the present day. Like nothing has changed. He's still crappy, and
Yeah,
now he's also an essayer. So there's that.
right. So, like you said, now we get into part two. It's called Gotten. Part two, chapter 12, is called Monkey Pants. So, we find out that Dodo ends up breaking his ankles, his hips, and his right fibula in the fall. And like Julia was mentioning earlier, at the end, it literally said like he went silent forever. So everybody's thinking, well, at least us, like he's
Yeah,
dead,
like he did.
like he's gone.
Like
And then all of a sudden he wakes up handcuffed in the Pottstown Hospital and he's getting transferred to the Penn State Hospital. I was like, what do you mean? You said he was silent forever. So
literally, we were like, what?
yeah, that part tripped me up. But so this Penhurst State Hospital is literally for people they deem insane or feeble-minded. Um, he gets we basically get like an encapsulating deep like we just get encapsulated how he feels and what he's like smelling at the moment. So it said like he was surrounded by overwhelming odor that signified like cruelty and anger and loneliness. And I know at one point he compared it to the smells that he felt or smelled at the Heaven and Earth grocery store, like with Chona, how it was like, you know, like soft and all that stuff.
Hmm.
So Dodo was laying in a steel crib in Ward C1, and he meets a boy, or he sees a boy, and this boy is just like contorted to him. I think James McBride did a really, really good job of portraying this character and kind of describing him to us because in my mind he literally looks like a folded up pretzel.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Same.
so yeah. And so um he was just saying like he was so twisted, like his hands were like all over his face, his arms were all, his legs were up, like all this stuff. So because Dodo didn't know his name, he called him Monkey Pants. um and then we also found out that Monkey Pants is the way he is because he has cerebral palsy. um he Monkey Pants ends up teaching Dodo like survival rules, because this hospital is literally full of grown men. And so basically they do things to distract them from themselves and to be able to stay in Ward C1, like pooping themselves and, you know, like defecating and going to the bathroom on themselves, like all this stuff. Um, so basically, it's Dodo trying to adapt to where he is right now.
Yes, and I think chapter 12 is also super important because not only do you realize that Dodo is not dead, you also realize that he's actually been captured, which I think when I was reading chapter 11, I was like, oh God, like, I hope, like, I knew it was a dumb decision to jump off the roof, but he doesn't know any better. But I was like,
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I hope that in the end he didn't get caught, you know? And now in chapter 12, you're like, ah, like he got caught. And
Yeah, he
not even
literally
that he
got
just
caught.
got caught, he got sent to the worst ward that you could be on in the insane asylum because he didn't know how to. It's not like he didn't know. He knows like he's intellectual, but because he was deaf and didn't really want to speak to people, he got sent to Ward C or Ward C1.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really sad.
Yeah.
So then this was, I think we had discussed this too. Like chapter 13 was called Cowboy. It is honestly a very, very random chapter. But what it does is you kind of like dip your toe back into Malachi. You're like, oh, Malachi has been
Mm-hmm.
gone for kind of a weird time. Let's bring him back in a way that's random in our
Mm-hmm.
minds. Totally tell us if we're completely wrong on this, but that's how we felt. So in chapter 13, Moshe is visiting a ice skating rink called Ringing Rocks, and he's kind of just thinking about Chona because at this point, after the incident with Doc Roberts, Chona is now actually in a coma in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So she's not doing well. And at the same time, Dodo's at his little Penhurst thing and not great. So Chona basically had mentioned the feeling the vibrations at the rink helped Dodo whenever they had spent time together because of course Dodo is deaf, so a lot of his senses like smell and feel are heightened. And
Mm-hmm.
basically the previous night the two bands fought over a headliner because this is all happening at once where he's visiting the rink and then he's also thinking about how at the theater a bunch of stuff was going down. So the two bands were Mario Bauza, I'm probably completely butchering that, so I'm sorry, and the Afro Cubans. Those were the two bands that were agreeing to go on stage. But the Afro Cubans had agreed to go on the stage first. And basically, after a whole powwow, Moshe was like, Chona always dealt with this for me. She knows exactly what to
Mm-hmm.
say to get people to feel happy. But at this instant, he's like, I have to deal with it myself. So he basically pulls Mario aside, is like, hey, could you just like go first? Or, could you just go first for this one time? My wife, she's in a coma. It's not, she's not doing well. And Mario was like, okay, like I'll go first. And then what he ends up finding out is that the entertainment world is changing because Mario and the people who came to see him, he like lit up that theater. People were eating him up. And then
Mm-hmm.
after that, the Afro Cubans went on. They were like, oh, this is like really awkward. Like, wow, that they were like really good. So he learns that. And in the same chapter, Moshe writes the letter to Malachi. You like see him scribbling stuff, like crossing it out, doing it again, because he doesn't know what to write to Malachi. Because at this point, he's like, Malachi and I only write about good things.
Yep.
So he finds out that Malachi has settled on a chicken farm in Poland. And he basically concludes that the old ways will not survive in this new environment. So he writes a letter to Malachi, and then Malachi like had sent him these like Molestein, right? Or I forgot what it was. It was like a pants. It was pants that I guess were fancy with like a little
They
thing
were
that
miniature ones.
yeah,
It
it
was
was
miniature leather ones.
yeah. So he's like, oh, okay, like I'm gonna send it back, and then that was just like a random thing. Like you get introduced to Malachi again. And then basically he decides that he's going to talk now about Dodo with Addie and Isaac. But Nate's like, you know what? It's in God's hands now. Like Dodo is in the insane asylum. They basically, you almost basically feel like what they're not going to do anything to help Dodo because Nate's like, nah, it's in
Mm-hmm.
God's hands now. So that's kind of a weird
Yes.
confusing chapter for 13. It was like a bunch of random things going on.
Yeah, that made me kind of mad because I, I it's at this point nobody knows that Dodo didn't do anything wrong. And I think with Nate and stuff, there was so much uncertainty with what happened between him and Doc Roberts and Chona that no one wanted to speak of it.
Hmm.
But why didn't Addie say anything?
I know. I think like that part, I feel like we never get clarity on why Addie didn't say anything. But I think at the end, you can only basically conclude that she was probably scared. Like she didn't, she doesn't want to step on the white people's toes, is kind of the feeling I got. But like it was really frustrating because Addie was there in the corner because you find out kind of
Mm-hmm.
later on.
Yeah. Um, so I'm gonna put chapter 14 and 15 together because they're both really random. Chapter 14 is called Differing Weights and Measures. They talk about Fatty Davis and how he's an owner of a juke joint in Chicken Hill, and he's obviously concerned about Nate and his drinking. So Nate literally like up and left Addie and just like started drinking for like days on end. Like for what reason? Who knows?
Mhm.
Um, We also learned that Fatty served 2 years at the Graterford prison, where he learned that Nate was also incarcerated, and he was under the name Nate Love. And so Rusty, Fatty, and Nate convince well, Rusty and Fatty convince Nate to stop drinking, and they want to bring him home. And Nate teaches them that different weights means different measures. So then they kind of conclude all together like they need to break Dodo out of Penhurst. That that one was just a little random to me. Like I get like Nate having drinking problems and stuff, but we could have definitely smushed that into a different chapter. It was just
I
that was all it was about.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think I felt like what James McBride was trying to tell you was that people are scared of Nate. Like in the prison, when Fatty was recalling that, he was like, he met the dude who had like beaten someone up or stabbed his eye out, and then was,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I would never do that to Nate. Like if Nate looked at me sideways, I would go and like bow down, you know? So I think we learned that Nate is like scary. So they were terrified that he was drinking because he might have spiraled back into what he was.
Mm-hmm. And then chapter 15 is called The Worm. Big Soap's mom, her name is Fiora, and she ends up meeting her friend named Pia, who tells her that Doc Roberts is a nasty worm and has also put his fast hands on her.
Hmm.
And when I tell you again, my jaw dropped. This dude just never gets better. He's literally the epitome of scum. Um, Fiora heard like the same kind of rumors about Doc Roberts in the past, and she's very, very, very convinced that something had happened between Chona and Doc Roberts. But she somehow mixes her son into all of it, but he was like not even there, not
Yeah.
even involved at all. And so his mom is like literally going in on him and his friend, like, tell me what you know, like, why did you do it, like, why were you there, like all this stuff. And he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, lady. um but Fatty and Rusty try to calm her down and just try to explain that they know what's going on with Dodo. And also we find out that Dodo's real name is Holly Herring, which was also a super random fact.
Yeah, I was like, "Oh,
I
fun
don't know.
fact."
Yeah. And then Fatty also explained that Chona was found with her clothes kind of like up and like torn off of her. Then Rusty was like, "Yeah, Addie was the first to arrive there, and literally the only two people who know what happened between her and Doc Roberts is Addie and Dodo." And then that was pretty much it.
Yeah, this chapter was just a lot going on too because I think you start to realize that Doc Roberts, I mean, not start to realize, you know, and it's confirmed that this guy is an essayer and he sucks and he's a freaking doctor. So let that sink in. But like after more character introductions, a little bit of adding to the storyline, then you are brought back on chapter 16 into Chona and Isaac and all of that. So chapter 16 is called The Visit. This is where Isaac provides Chona a private room in a reading hospital, but you start to see again the ideas of different communities because nurses are super unhappy with the frequent visits of their patient's Jewish husband and black friends. So 4 days later, Nate and Moshe visit Chona, and Addie, of course, is already there because she's a tried and true friend and is like never leaving Chona's side. Love that for Addie, honestly, being the most fantastic friend to Chona. The Timlins give Moshe some privacy with his wife, and Addie witnesses, you know, because Addie had witnessed the assault that Doc Roberts had on Chona. Nate was like, just don't say anything. Like, we don't want trouble. Don't say anything, even if you saw it. And then their conversation turns to Dodo, of course, because they start talking about, like, hey, why don't you visit Dodo? And Nate's like, I can't bring myself to visit, you know, the Penhurst Insane Asylum because it's like, it's prison like and it makes me uncomfortable. But this is where they still kind of ponder the idea if anyone can help them bust Dodo out of Penhurst. So Nate suggests Reverend Ed Spriggs, which we had kind of told you before, they're all in the same like society that met at Nate and Addie's house. But
Mm-hmm.
Addie's like, I don't know. I kind of think that he's the one who told about Dodo being hidden at Chona's house. And so you know, she's like, I wouldn't if I were you. And then she's like, hey, but you really got to go visit Dodo. Like, come on, get your ass in gear.
Literally. And like the fact that he kept refusing, I was just kind of like, why?
I know.
But chapter 17 is called The Bullfrog. Again, super random chapter. But a huge bullfrog was discovered in the mikveh, in the women's bathing pool at the shul. And then uh, there's a new congregant that's like, hey, we should build a new mikveh, and gives like a huge donation with for no reason. Um, Rabbi Feldman explains that his late predecessor, who is Chona's father, hired Shad Davis to run a water line from the dairy to the shoal. And I think in this chapter, they had a at this point, I don't remember if their water supply had started to deteriorate or what happened,
Yeah.
but they were trying to get the pipelines from the main city to Chicken Hill. And so they were trying to figure out like where the well water was coming from in the first place. Um, the town, they because a lot of them didn't like the way Chicken Hill was like shaping up to be. They were like, yeah, no, we're not. Oh, like sorry, we're busy. We can't come and check the water lines, or oh, there's like there was just always excuses. That was pretty much it for that chapter, I think.
Yeah, and I think although this chapter the name was super random, it's only really important because I think now you kind of get the sense that there's like two storylines kind of intertwining here. Like you have Dodo in the insane asylum, and then you have
Hmm.
this thing with the water. And so it was necessary to have this chapter, but it doesn't tie together until the very, very end, where you're like, okay, I see why chapter 17 was necessary. Because when I read it, I was like,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, like we're talking
Yeah.
about a bullfrog in the bathwater. I get it, dirty, but what, like, so
Right.
then sad things happen. I feel like this book just like kept getting sadder until the end. But chapter
Yeah.
18 is called The Hot Dog. At first, when we read it, we were like, at first, I think when we read the title, we were like, hot dog. Okay, yeah, sure. So this is super sad. But Chona wakes up a week after the assault because remember, she was in a coma and I'm totally not going to know how to say this. She's speaking Baruch Shiamar and she's feeling overwhelmed with love and guilt. But when she wakes up, she's in the room with Addie, Nate, Bernice, Isaac, Rabbi Feldman, and the Skrupskillis twins, as well as I believe Moshe is there too, like holding her hand or something like that.
Hmm.
And at this point, she doesn't know because she's been in a coma that Dodo is in the insane asylum. So she's like, "Where's
Yeah.
Dodo?" And she's like, "Oh no, I'm getting sick. I have some pain in my head, my stomach." And so Moshe's like, "All right, everyone out. Let's give her some space." But the reason it's called hot dog is because when she first wakes up, she's like, "What are you doing eating that hot dog?" Like that's what she says. And no one was eating the hot dog. We'll tell you that now. No one was eating the hot dog. So ding ding ding, red flag. Like she's hallucinating. So that's not a good sign.
Hmm.
So then when Moshe ushers everyone out, Feldman tries to talk to Isaac about a letter he sent to the wealthy theater owner about the water situation and Doc Roberts. And Isaac sternly answers that he didn't hear anything. Like he didn't get the letter. He had never heard that name and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden you like Moshe is just wailing, so he's wailing, he's crying, and then of course everyone's like slowly making their way there. They're like, "Oh my gosh, what's happening?" And that's when James McBride alludes to the fact that Chona has passed away, and of course it's very sad. And I think Chona was also saying before all that happened, she's like, okay, I'm feeling like it's my time to go. I've got to tell Moshe that. And of course, she smells the hot dog that isn't there and then she dies. And so this was very, very sad because I feel like Chona was the glue for a lot of people. And having her pass away is very significant because she's not going to see Dodo again. She's not going to see how the ending plays out. But she herself was such a big activist that her passing away was like, it was just sad. It was very, very sad.
Hmm. And I think also, I know we talked about like the character development from the beginning, but James McBride did such a good job attaching us to Chona and even to Dodo. Like I didn't feel attached to any other character other than
Mhm.
those two. That when she passed away, I actually felt extremely sad.
Right, because I thought she
Um,
was gonna live, but
mhm. And then So chapter 18 wrapped up part 2. And so we start into part 3 called The Last Love. We start into chapter 19 called The Low Gods. So Fatty Davis is the only person who ends up not attending Chona's funeral. He appreciates the family support after his father's death, but he hasn't been to a funeral since his dad passed away. Paper ends up asking Fatty to help Nate and Addie break Dodo out of Penthurst, mainly because Paper knows that she can get anything from him because he is secretly in love with her. um, they drive back to Hemlock Row, and then there's a claptrap group of shacks with distrust between the black community. So I think here they were really just trying to build up. Now there are so many different communities within the black community that there was just a lot of discord going on. Fatty and Soap, uh, they watch Paper go into one of the shacks because she was trying to get some information. Paper joins a group led by Mickey Flood, and yeah, Mickey asks about their family and then their relationships and the type of fortunes that they had. Uh, and then after her clients leave, Miggy tells Paper that there's a person called Son of Man that could help free Dodo. But she warns her that the man is like extremely messed up, which we later found out he is extremely messed up. So yeah, that was pretty much it for that one. And then
Yeah.
Mickey was also a fortune teller, I think.
Yeah, like she kind of was like the fortune teller, but I think she kind of reveals that she's not really like a fortune teller. Like she does it to give people hope in the like in
Mm-hmm.
the um Hemlock Road community, because here I think the main thing to note is that they say the Low Gods is they're a community that is actually made up of two distinct families, the Low Gods and then the Loves, which if you recall, Nate, his original
Is a
last
love.
name is the
Mm-hmm.
yeah, is a Love. So this is also basically letting you know that, Nate comes from a different background than what he actually is right now, which becomes
Mm-hmm.
important because, of course, the incarceration, all that stuff. So now, of course, we get introduced to new character Miggy, which is really important. But now we kind of switch gears. We talk about the Low Gods and Hemlock Row. We're going back now in chapter 20 to the Antis house, which is going to talk about this basically a KKK parade and Memorial Day celebration. But Pottstown celebrates Memorial Day with a huge parade, and you get introduced to Gus Plitzka, who is the
Mm-hmm.
chairman of a city council and the new owner of Pottstown largest dairy company, which is very important because the dairy company is like there was a lot of discourse with this dairy company, Gus Plitzka, in terms of chapter with the bullfrog, where they're talking about how they don't have water, but Gus Plitzka is basically the dude that you need to ask for water because he's city council, but because he
Mm-hmm.
hates everybody, he's not going to help them basically. But here you find that as they're trying to get ready for this parade, he's distracted by the pain in his big toe and it's very swollen. So he asks Doc Roberts to examine it, who is like, like, mm. And Doc Roberts, after the whole incident, is super scatterbrained. He
Mm-hmm.
is, I don't want to say he's feeling guilt. I don't really think he's feeling guilt. I think he's scared to get caught, is more like it.
Yep.
So Chona's death really sends him into a spiral that's like, oh my gosh, she's dead. What if
Mm-hmm.
someone finds out? Blah, blah, blah. But Gus and Roberts are political rivals. Like, they are not friends. They kind of are like frenemies. They pretend to be friends because they're enemies. And so he realizes too that he has taken the mezuzah that Chona was wearing, and he's like, I gotta get rid of this evidence. Like, no one can link this to me. But he's like, nah, but I didn't do anything wrong. I just have to get rid of the evidence so it's not suspicious. And so with this whole thing with the Memorial Day parade, he's like, fine, I'll befriend Gus and I'll help treat his toe, blah 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 blah, and also just help basically refer him to get a special shoe that will help him walk because Doc, of course, has shoes made from the Scrubskelis brothers as well.
Mm-hmm. This is when my gears started turning and turning and turning because I was like, he has the mezuzah? Like, I didn't, and then I was like, it just brought me back. That's when I
Yep.
was like, whoa.
Right.
So, chapter 21 is called The Marble. I don't think we ever mentioned, but Chono used to give Dodo marbles. And he had like a bunch of them, and that was actually one of the first thing he asked for when he woke up from his fall. But Dodo finds a lot of comfort in Monkey Pants, who Monkey Pants ended up having a blue marble. Out of all things he had a blue marble. Don't know where he got it from, but he had one. Um, this really reminded Dodo of obviously the marbles that he got from Chona, Nate, and Addie. Um, Dodo felt extremely lonely. He cried very often. And it was hard for him and Monkey Pants because there was just no form of communication that they could have. Obviously, Dodo couldn't hear, and he would try to read Monkey Pants' lips, but that just wasn't working for them. So they developed like a kind of sign language where they could talk to each other. So that was really sweet. Um, 5 weeks into his stay, Dodo ends up encountering this really tall black man who has a huge scar on his forehead. And he was, it said that he was kind of like, I don't really know how to explain, but anyways, he was there. And Dodo kind of looks over at Monkey Pants, and Monkey Pants signs to him all the letters of Son of Man. And this is who Son of Man is. And remember, we already met him with the Mickey and Paper chapter, but we don't really find out who Son of Man is other than the fact that he's like this big, muscular, scary man.
Yep. So I think this is important because, like, you see Son of Man as someone who's supposed to be able to maybe potentially help, but I think what they also present is that Son of Man is someone you have to get through to actually
Mm-hmm.
successfully break Dodo out because he runs the place. And so it's scary because Son of Man is a low, I forget what, I always forget, like, it's the low god. So he is a low god. So he comes from Hemlock Row, so that's how people know him.
Mm-hmm.
So then you kind of get the background. He meets Son of Man. You get the vibe that he's very bad, um, because he's basically like he's a child essayer. Like that's what he is. Like that's what how they describe him in 21 because he looks at Dodo's bottom and is like, "Wow, you're so pretty." So
Mm-hmm.
trigger warning about that. But then you go back to Moshe and everybody else in chapter 22, where he's now selling the Heaven Earth grocery store. And he, along with Addie and Nate, are cleaning out the basement. And Addie's telling Moshe the truth about what happened because she was there. And basically, like, Doc Roberts' version is wrong. Dodo didn't attack Chona. Dodo basically saved Chona from getting sexually assaulted. And of course, Moshe, being the guy who has no balls that he is, he's super scared to challenge Roberts because he doesn't want any police involvement. He doesn't want to get involved with the government, all of that stuff. But he ends up opening a box and he sees Chona's toys and basically all the marbles and stuff she used to collect from kids and even give to Dodo, all that stuff. And he basically feels really, really sad. And then Isaac arrives randomly with Malachi. So, surprise, Malachi is now here. And
Mm-hmm.
he's like, oh, Malachi's here because he decided to stay in America because this is where Adolf Hitler was coming into power. And he's like, Poland's really dangerous right now for Jewish people. So what happens later is that Isaac has a talk with Nate because he's like, okay, I get the inkling that Addie knows something. And he's like, here, do you want some money? And basically offers him a huge roll of money in exchange for information about what happened that day. And Nate's like, I don't need money. Like, it's just going to be a cycle of you give me money, I hire a lawyer, and then I get in trouble again and I have to hire another lawyer, all that stuff. So he's like, hey, but instead, you should talk to Bernice because Bernice was also harboring Dodo. And maybe she could use
Mm-hmm.
the money because she's got so many kids. And so, because of that, he goes over, and that brings us into chapter 23.
Yeah, and so chapter 23 is called Bernice's Bible. And uh Bernice comes to see Fatty, and mind you, they're siblings, but they're not close. And this is partially due to the fact that Fatty just resented the fact that Bernice inherited their parents' house, and he just wasn't approving of like the lifestyle she was living, essentially. Um, Bernice tells Fatty that Reverend Spriggs was the one who confessed to the state where Dodo was, and um, Fatty was like, "Nah, there's no way, the Reverend," and she was like, "No, yeah, for real, it was." And so Bernice basically says that the man from the state was more interested in having an easy day at work than actually getting Dodo to where he was supposed to be. And that's why he was tipped off every single time that he came. Um, they end up talking about Chona, and Bernice asks Fatty why he didn't go to the funeral. Um, she really believed that there was solidarity between Chicken Hill's Black and Jewish communities. And so she she's just really curious as to why he didn't go. Bernice ends up asking Fatty about the well that their father dug, which is that same well that we were talking about earlier where they were getting water from with the bullfrog. And she wanted to know, like, does he know where it's at? Did he help with the construction of it? Where was it? All that stuff. And so Fatty basically says, like, he knows where it is. He was the one who helped his dad with it, and he'd be able to find it if given, the tools or whatever. And Bernice ends up giving him a Bible that has $500 on one page and $400 on another page, and a note. And then he was so excited about the money that he ended up not even reading the note.
Yeah, Fatty's kind of like, I feel like he's a very, they describe, in my mind, he's almost like a gentle giant, but
Mm-hmm.
he's very
He's
like clumsy.
Yeah, he's
I
kind of
don't,
dumb.
yeah, I agree. Him, Rusty, and Big Soap, they're like the Three Stooges, honestly, in my mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So then that kind of gives you background about some things that will come into play later. So of course you find out about the Bernice thing, and then the money I think is the big thing here, and of course Fatty's involvement in something that will kind of be later down the line. So
Mm-hmm.
then you end up finding out, this is where you really find out how awful the Son of Man is, and how there may be a way that Dodo can actually break out of Penhurst, because chapter 24 is called Duck Boy. So Paper gathers Miggy, Fatty, Nate, Addie, and Rusty at her house with the promise of one of her really famous sweet potato pies. And of course, Miggy and Nate, they grew up together in Hemlock Row, and Miggy recognizes him and is like, "Hey, do you remember me by chance?" Like this kind of, it's almost like she's fangirling, but in a weird way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Mickey also reveals that she works as a cleaner at Penhurst. So she knows the vast extent of the 34 buildings, how it's over 200 acres. It's got its own railroad, its own farm, its own police. Like it's got everything. It's basically its own town in itself. And she describes how awful it is, how cruel they are to the patients, how they neglect them, how the attendants and doctors don't care, all of that stuff. But she's now recounting how she basically knew a boy who was known as like Duck Boy because he quacked like a duck. And she's basically now recounting also Son of Man and how he abused, like child essayed Duck
Mm-hmm.
Boy. And when she herself confronted Son of Man about it, he's like he basically is like, tell anyone anything and I'm going to kill you. And so then one
Mm-hmm.
day, Duck Boy just disappeared. And she's recounting a story about how there's a bunch of old tunnels beneath the Penhurst, especially between, like, I think they said V1 and Ward C1. There's a specific underground railroad and tunnel that you can use to escape. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a black man in the Hemlock Row community who delivers breakfast, like eggs, coffee, every day to Penhurst employees, and knows his way around the tunnel like nobody else. So she's almost alluding to the fact that this guy who delivers the eggs and stuff has a secret compartment in his, like, wherever, how he does it and how he delivers it may have been the one to help him escape. And so she's like carving a piece of the map basically into this pie using, I think she uses like 3 or 4, and basically shows
Yeah.
them, right, like the route that they can take. And so basically when they're talking about this escape, she shows it to Nate, and Nate, of course, at this point, you know that he wants to break Dodo out, and he's very adamant, angry about it. And when he asks Miggy about Son of Man, he's like, "Oh, like, is he gonna recognize me?" And Miggy's like, like he knows you, man. Not so
Mm-hmm.
everyone knows Nate. He's the deal.
Right. And so then the next chapter is called The Deal. And Marvin Scrupskillis, I cannot ever say his name. goes to see Isaac, and Gus Plitzka recently came to see him about the shoes. And then Scrubskillis learned that Plitzka is indebted to a Philadelphia mob boss named Rosen. And Scrubskillis also informs Isaac that Plitzka runs the town's water department while secretly getting the water for his dairy factory for free. He suggests that someone put the squeeze on him so that he could put the squeeze on Doc Roberts. Isaac counters that exposing Plitzka would also reveal that the Shoals water situation. So he asks Grubskillis to find two trustworthy Jewish men to meet Dodo on a train out of Penhurst. Scrubskillis says that he can do it pretty easily because the Jewish union members who are working on the railroad loved Chona for her generosity and her passionate writings about justice. So they're on the plan and they're ready to go.
Yeah, and I think something that we had forgotten to mention earlier was that Chona and Gus have beef because Chona like is a really big activist and she was writing in the paper about like why are you guys marching for the KKK and all of that stuff. So between her, Doc Roberts, and Plitzka, they all had beef because she was not supporting the KKK in any way in this fashion. So
Mm-hmm.
then you keep going and now you get the background on like how Plitzka owes money to this gangster and that's basically how he got his injury with his big toe that Doc Roberts was fixing. And then chapter 26 is called The Job. So on Memorial Day, Fatty asks Big Soap to help him along with Rusty to go down near the old well near the dairy factory where, you know, they had dug the pipes and everything back then to rearrange it so that they can basically get the pipes running to the bathing house. And they're offered $35 for a few hours of work, which back then was a lot of money. And Big Soap was like, dang, like I could really use that money kind of in a way. And he finds out though that complications arise when Nate at the same time in the same night wants Fatty to drop him off at Hemlock Row so that he can meet Bullis, which is the egg delivery man. And Fatty
Mm-hmm.
explains the situation to Nate and is like, hey, like, does it have to be tonight? I've got a gig. And then Nate's like, you know what? It's fine. I'll find my own way. Just help me drop some stuff off and like it'll be fine. And Fatty agrees that he'll be ready though at midnight to pick Nate back up so that it's almost like he was never there at the asylum. So Fatty also
Mm-hmm.
tells Nate about the note that he accidentally didn't read and kind of tore off. And he's like, hey, Bernice gave me basically the $900. And then Nate realizes that it's Mr. Isaac's doing, kind of passing along the message, the money, so that it can all be set up for Dodo to escape. And then Nate also realizes that that $400 that was taped to the Bible separately is actually meant for Dodo to kind of help him through life in a sense after he is on the railroad trace station. So he's like, hey, you got to give me the money, give it to Addie because that's not for you. And Fatty, of course, hearing how scary Nate was, he's like, for anybody else, I would have said no. But for him, I'm going to go do that
Yes,
instantly.
I promise.
Yeah.
And I will say these last couple of chapters go really fast and a lot of stuff happens within just these chapters. So I promise it's not just us trying to get through it. This actually happened the way it did
Yeah.
because we even were like, oh my God, this is so much.
I know.
So chapter 27 is called The Finger. And Dodo finally gets his cast taken off and he um, kind of gets shuffled into the adult ward for the first time ever. And he kind of sees like where he's at and just taking it all in. Um, it said that there was non-disabled patients who flocked to the Son of Man, and other attendants defer to him. The Son of Man turned around to Dodo at one point and just like winked at him, just being a weirdo, creepy guy. Um, Dodo ends up going back to his crib and then he's like kind of in his own head like why hasn't anyone visited me? You know, like why hasn't Nate come to see me? Why hasn't Addie come to see me? And then he's like thinking in his head it's because I attacked Doc Roberts, who's a white man, and now he's in jail. Like he's here for the rest of his life. Um he says all of this to Monkey Pants and he doesn't agree with that and just tries to distract Dodo as much as he can to keep Dodo from crying and just feeling so miserable. From what I understood, their beds were hooked together in some sort of fashion to
Yeah.
where they were able to physically touch each other. So they would just hold fingers. They would hold
Like
fingers, and
literally
it
hold
was,
fingers like
yeah, it was so cute.
I know.
And it made me so sad because we don't meet Monkey Pants in the way beginning, but what we do know of Monkey Pants, again, emotional attachment.
Mhm.
So they held fingers for a while, and it just gave Dodo the comfort that he needed. But I feel like it also gave Monkey Pants a sense of comfort.
Yeah.
So I mean, they would keep their fingers together for hours on hours.
It was cute.
So an hour after the lights shut off in the ward, it was bedtime. All of a sudden, like, Monkey Pants lets go of Dodo's finger, and the Son of Man actually unclamps their beds together and presses a pillow up against Dodo's face. Again, just content warning. This is when Dodo actually ends up getting SA'd by the Son of Man. And Monkey Pants was the one who actually saved Dodo by throwing his feces at the Son of Man. Um, when he did this, it also for some reason triggered a seizure for him. So obviously, like, it started to draw a lot of attention. The nurses were in there, the ward lights were turned on, the doctors came in and started to administer some medication to Monkey Pants. And they were like, huh, so strange. Why are the beds
Mhm.
pulled apart? And like nothing ever came of that. They were just like, oh, just put them back together. Like, what? And like the Son of Man is there, no one's saying anything. Like, that was just so strange to me. But anyways, Dodo, after all the chaos happened, the Son of Man ended up leaving. The beds are hooked back together, and Dodo, like, in his mind, he's just scared that the Son of Man is going to come back and get him. But again, Monkey Pants is there for him, holding his finger. After all that, but then when they wake up in the morning, Monkey Pants is dead,
I
but they
know.
were still holding
I know.
fingers.
I felt like when we had talked about it, Chona's death, sad. Monkey Pants' death, devastating. Like
Devastating.
I was so upset. Like I know that Monkey Pants probably like the introduction of his character, he wasn't gonna last. Like I knew that, but it's the fact that they were still holding fingers and then he literally saved Dodo from further essay that
Yes.
it like touched me. It just I don't know. And it's sad that we never know Monkey Pants' name. Like they never say the
I
name. Like we only know
know.
him as Monkey Pants. But I think something that we failed to kind of mention is like Son of Man runs Ward C1. So when we're
Hmm.
referring to Son of Man of like people flocking him, they make the very distinct like fact known that it doesn't matter in this place if you are white or if you're black, if you're Jewish or whatever, like you follow Son of Man because he is the it guy. He runs
Yeah.
that ward, so people let him do whatever they want, whatever he wants, and all of that stuff. So
Hmm.
because he's got so much power, like you can almost imagine how scary it was that Monkey Pants literally sacrificed himself to essentially save Dodo. And that to me just
Hmm.
hit me so much harder because I was like, you know what, Monkey Pants, you've got more balls than Moshe. And that's crazy because you're a 12-year-old boy who's got cerebral
Literally.
palsy and literally can barely defend himself. So,
Hmm.
heartbreaking. That was heartbreaking for
So
me.
sad.
I know. I
So
was like
sad.
so
I can't
heartbroken.
believe it. At that point, I just wanted to stop reading the book. I was like, no.
I know. I'm like, ugh. So, okay. I guess in a way they had to do that because then I bet then you would have had to save Monkey Pants and Dodo.
Yeah, we
And
could have did that though.
I know. And I'm like, we could have done that. But James McBride was like, no, we can't. So here we are,
Gotta leave them.
heartbroken.
Yeah.
So chapter 28, things are still, the balls are moving. They're meeting about, getting Dodo out. And this is where the ball actually starts to move because Nate's on his way. So it's called The
Yep.
Last Love. And Anna Morse is an owner of Morse's funeral home and is actually Nate's former employer. And that's who he finds instead of Fatty to take him to Hemlock Row. So Nate is supposed to meet with Miggy and Bullis at 11:30, but basically he feels like something is wrong. Nate's like, his spidey senses are tingling, and he's like, nah, something's wrong. So at 3 a.m., they realize Miggy and Bullis are like, guess he's not guess he's not showing up. Something must have happened. And Bolus is actually relieved because he was keeping it a secret to the like the low gods and Hemlock Row that like he was helping Nate. So as he's setting out for Penhurst, he stops to use like some well water or something like that. But then he hears like a whinnying from his horse. And then he notices as they're going through the tunnels, his horse is like panting more than usual. And he's like, that's weird. I mean, do we just have more eggs or what's going on? But
Mm-hmm.
he makes his first stop, and then that's fine. And then when he reaches Ward C1, Son of Man, he says, doesn't ever greet him. Like, he just takes the eggs and he goes. But this time, Son of Man greets him with like a really creepy smile and is accusing him of helping someone escape. And so he must have gotten word that Dodo was trying to escape. And actually, I believe it said that Miggy was the one who told him, or he saw Miggy packing bags for a boy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So he starts beating Bolus with the sock because it doesn't leave marks. I think that's what they said. But all of a sudden, who's hiding in the egg cart? Nate. He
Who?
didn't show up. He snuck into the egg cart. So
Oh
he
yeah.
like sees, right? I'm like, to the rescue. He seizes Son of Man's wrist and then stabs him right in the heart with a kitchen knife. Son of Man
Mm-hmm.
dead. And so literally. And so then it kind of describes that Nate was able to retrieve Dodo, and then he moved to South Carolina. He hitched the train that was all set up for them. And then it kind of gives background that at age 13, he had killed his father before for beating his mother to death. And then he became the
Mm-hmm.
last love on Hemlock Row. And he survived by begging, stealing, and then he earned a living later by laying suffering on any human for a price. So that's kind of how
Mm-hmm.
he got his rep, and then he was ultimately sent to prison, of course, for murder. So this right here was the crazy part because he just up and left Addie, y'all. Like he did, he was
Yeah.
like, and I think the whole time Addie was like, "Are you really not going to go in there? You promised me you're not going to go in there." He's like, "Yeah, like I'm not going to go." And then what does he do? He goes in
Goes.
there. He goes in there, and then he just takes Dodo and just leaves. And I was like, he just left his whole wife that he's claimed got rid of the evil in his heart. How do you? And then, but then he does that thing where he's like, "Well, she deserves better. Like I'm leaving her because she deserves." I'm like, full fucking shit, bro. Like
You
you
could have took her with.
exactly. You could have been like, "Hey, meet me
Could
at
have
the
came and
train
got
station."
her. Yeah.
Yeah, like meet me at the train
Something.
station. But anyways, that's besides the point. And that's
Yeah.
that's chapter 28.
Chapter 29, Waiting for the Future. So the narrative moves back in time by several hours. Some of Potsdam's Jewish business owners, including the Skrupskillis brothers, are expected to store, repair, and organize the costumes for the annual Memorial Day parade for free. Who does anything for free? I don't know.
Mhm.
However, this year, the costumes, they arrived and they were like all messed up. So as a result of all of this, Plitzka and Doc Roberts, who are the parade marshals, they end up wearing the wrong uniforms, right? So they ended up wearing red coats for British officers. Plitzka was supposed to find them blue army coats. Um, but yeah, that was a whole thing. So there's a man named Henry Litt who approached Plitzka, and he was like, he's gonna reveal that Plitzka's stealing water from the town until he repays Rosen. And Plitzka was like, I don't have the money. And he was like, okay, well, we'll talk later, I guess. Maybe tonight after the parade. And I was just like, what?
I know. He's like, I'm gonna kill you, aka.
It literally, he was just like, I'm threatening you. Oh, you don't have time? Okay, I'll do it later. Like, that was weird. Um, so, anywho's, Politska ends up only finding one blue coat, and Doc Roberts ends up having to keep the red one. So later that night after the parade, Roberts leaves the red coat. Uh, he leaves the red coat on and starts drinking with the local fire company, which was just 2 blocks away from where they were. And Fatty, and then 2 blocks away from where they were, Fatty and Big Soap start removing the Wells cement cover, which ends up snapping in half and falls in. So they start climbing down and examining the plumbing, and then Fatty realizes that Plitz's Gary is again getting the free water from the town. And Fatty and Soap have to release some of the water from the reservoir pipe, and the well starts to fill up to their necks. And then that was like before they could even turn off the water. Um, so they move the Schultz pipe so that it can start getting the water from the reservoir for free. Rusty still hasn't arrived with any of the materials that they needed to in order to replace that cement cover. So Fatty and Soap have to separate and gather some materials to end up looking for him. At this point, Doc Roberts is drunk and he starts ranting about America's decline, and he he starts internalizing how Chona has rejected him. And so out loud he goes, "Didn't she know who I was?" And everyone's just kind of like, you
Yeah.
should
Yeah,
probably
they're
go
like,
home."
okay.
Yeah, just go home. Do something with yourself. So he decides to go home, and he takes a shortcut through the lots from the dairy factory so that he can dispose of the mezuzah that he has. And then Henry Litt ends up mistaking the mistaking Doc Roberts for Politska, and then ends up breaking his jaw with brass knuckles. And then Roberts just falls into the well.
Chapter one
So
reference.
yeah, so Fatty and Big Soap didn't see the body when they returned and just poured cement over him.
Yep.
That
So
was insane.
this, I feel like this ties the story together very, very well. So, of course, now we know whose body it was in chapter one when they discovered a body with a mezuzah. Like, now we
Hmm.
know. But it also was just 0 to 100 real quick. Like, the storyline suddenly
Super
picked up
quick.
and then was like, whoa, 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 what are we doing? And then suddenly, boom. But so then they give you an epilogue that kind of ties it together even more because
Yep.
it's called The Call Out. And this is where they tell you that two Jewish railroad workers that Isaac had hired, that we had said in an earlier chapter, ended up helping Nate and Dodo board the train and then, along their way, dropped them off where they need to be. And
Hmm.
they were given like a note with $40 from the shoemaking guy and then also a promise of free shoes. And then basically they make it to Philadelphia and then of course to South Carolina. And he at that point, like I said, had internalized like, oh, I'm never gonna see Addie again. Like it's fine. And then ironically, Addie actually ends up she's smart. She found him, they were reunited, it was all good. So then
Yep.
they, I think this is now coming from Dodo's perspective, honestly. And he kind of says, like, years later, Isaac, Moshe, they end up establishing a Camp Chona for children with disabilities using, like
Yes.
the memory stuff. And using the money from Isaac, Dodo ends up buying a farm in South Carolina. He ends up marrying, has a bunch of kids, and he still kind of calls, great uncle Nate. Like, it was really cute, but he kind of ends up saying that his memories of Pennsylvania fade away, except for Chona and Monkey Pants, who really offered him the love, the support that he really needed in those times. So he ends up changing his name, though, to Nate Love the Second. So cute.
That's
And then
sweet.
it tells
Yeah.
you that Nate Love, of course, the second, so Dodo, dies on June 22nd, 1972, the very day that Hurricane Agnes strikes, just like chapter one. And his last words ever are "thank you, Monkey Pants." And I love Monkey Pants. Like, it just was so sad. But honestly speaking, it was the book, like, just 0 to 100 so quick. And I think the epilogue did a very good job of tying everything together. Like,
Hmm.
I felt like we had questions that were unanswered, but I don't necessarily think they needed to be answered because the book kind of does a good job. Like, you get to see the characters, you get to see the storyline, you get to see how justice was served for Chona, of course, by Doc Roberts being attacked because he decided he was going to keep the blue jacket, I mean the red jacket instead of the blue. So Karma really got him. I wish Karma also got Gus, but you can't win them all.
Yeah, and I think it did a like it kind of gave like a full circle moment. I
Hmm.
feel like you said in the beginning we were kind of confused and stuff, but everything did end up tying together, and I don't know, it was a wild ride. That was for sure. And the ending, like I said, just came so fast. Like there was just, oh, 1 minute and then another one and then Dodo's out, but then Doc Roberts dies and then there's it was all squished in just a few chapters. But for what it was really good.
Yeah, and I think overall it was really good. Like I think we had already addressed. It's not a book that we would read on our own. Like if I were to go to a grocery store or Barnes and Noble, I probably wouldn't have picked it up because it's just not
Mm-hmm.
something I usually read. But
Mm-hmm.
I can see why it won Book of the Year. It touched on very important topics. It was very well tied together, and it
Yeah.
honestly wasn't a hard read. Like I know when I read
Yeah.
stuff like
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare, I'm like, I can't. It's like 20 minutes to read two
Mm-hmm.
lines. But this was honestly a pretty easy read and things were understandable, except of course there was research that needed to be done on the Jewish community and the terms they use, like their ideals and stuff like that. But I think we had kind of discussed too that after reading the book, we think that Dodo was actually the main character. Like felt like everything was coming from his perspective.
Mm-hmm. And even if not, it was kind of like centered around him and like Chono. Because even in the epilogue, if it wasn't about Dodo, or if that it wasn't completely about Dodo, why did we end the epilogue with only about what happened to Dodo? What happened to
Right.
Moshe? What happened to Malachi? What happened, like there was no other characters other than Dodo. And like
Right.
I wish it would have done more of that in the beginning,
Mhm.
because in the beginning we kind of only get the, oh, we feel bad for him because he's deaf and dumb, and like his mom's oven exploded and now he's deaf. Like that's really all we got from it, and other than the
Right.
fact that him and Chona had a good relationship, which we even had to assume that because it only seemed like Chona was like, oh, we're just keeping him because whatever. And the only
Right.
time we really got a glimpse of their relationship was when they were going to the skating rink, when she would do the sounds for him or
Right.
whatever. But that was it.
I agree. And I think like with that being said, I wish there was even more background on Dodo. Like that the accident caused him to lose both his eyesight at one point and his hearing, and
Mm-hmm.
only his eyesight came back. But
Mm-hmm.
like I wanted more. And I kind of think
Mm-hmm.
I wanted more on just his background with not only his mom but his dad too. I don't forget if they even mentioned it, but it was
Mm-mm.
just it's an interesting book for sure. And I think too we had kind of also said, maybe the cover is Dodo, because I remember when
Mm-hmm.
we did judge a book by its cover, we were like, what is that? What is
Who
this
is it?
person holding?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now to me it makes sense that it might be Dodo, because to us it looked like a basketball or like a ball. And it makes sense
Mm-hmm.
because 12-year-olds are going to play with something. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And
Also, I think there was like missed opportunity with being able to give background information on the day that the stove did explode.
mhm,
Like I feel like there could have been something there to kind of add that more of that element into the story, because when we found out that Dodo's mom died, we were just kind of like, oh, like there was
right.
no like, oh, I feel bad for him. Like, I mean, I did feel bad for him, but like, I was just kind of like, oh, well, his mom died. Like, you know?
Right. And I wonder, like, part of me is wondering if everything is so intentional. Like, to me, it just seems like it should be intentional because James McBride is a phenomenal writer. And to me, I'm
Mm-hmm.
almost like, okay, did they make us not feel attached to his mom and his background because they wanted us to feel attached to Chona as his mother figure? But then I was like, well,
Mm.
Addie and Nate took him on first, you know? So
Actually,
if
yeah.
anything, right, like, because his mom was Addie's sister. So I'm like,
Yep.
if anything, shouldn't it have been Addie that was the mom figure? But, I don't know. I'm not an English major, so if I'm interpreting completely wrong, people are like, what the heck?
I know. No, I definitely agree with you. But just going into all of that, favorite character of the novel?
Monkey Pants, hands down, it's Monkey Pants. Like, I'm still heartbroken. How about you?
I think I want to say it's Chona, but it's not. It would definitely have to be Dodo or Monkey Pants. And the only reason for me, for Monkey Pants, is just the amount of comfort that he offered Dodo.
Hmm.
I think in such a short period of time, we had a lot of character development between the both of them. So that makes him one of my favorite characters. But also Dodo, because I feel like he went through so much, like,
Yep,
and he still persevered through all of that, ended up having a happy life, and just, I don't know, he's very grateful. I think that was also a big thing too. Like he never took anything that he was given for granted.
exactly. And that speaks a lot when you are in a community that is not in your favor, and you of course have to go through more things than a normal person would have to go through. So I agree,
Mhm.
Dodo was very significant, and he was also, between the two of them, like he's also probably one of my favorite characters. But what would you say, like would you recommend this book for a lot of people? I guess it's to each their own, but what would you say about that?
I would say it's a different read, right? Like we mentioned this earlier, it's not something that we would just pick up like normally if we saw it, but I do think it's worth the read. Like I it's a different genre. It's heavy. It's,
Hmm.
but it's also lighthearted at the same time. There's just like there's so much to the story. Like it doesn't even do it justice for us to talk about it. Like
Yeah.
it's just something you have to experience on your own. So yeah,
Yeah.
definitely I would recommend that. I would recommend the read.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you as well. I think it's definitely something that people should read. It's definitely, it opens your eyes to a lot of things because it's historical, and
Hmm.
you just see how reading it from now when things are so different, it really opens your eyes. And like we said, it's 0 to 100 real quick, but the story was also very good. Like I was holding
Yeah,
on to my edge of my seat in the last half. I was like, no. So
I know.
I definitely think that it's
Well,
also a good read.
speaking on the edge of your seat, continuing Black History Month, we are going to read next. It's called Disappearing Acts. I've already started reading it. Julia's going to start reading it this week, but whoa. We are super excited to kind of switch gears, switching from something that's a little heavy and a little dark to something a little more lighthearted, romance. So we hope that you guys really enjoyed this episode. Let us know what you think. If you guys ended up reading the story or if you will read it. We have a Q&A section on Spotify. So leave us some comments. We'll try to answer your questions back. And we just hope that this gets you guys excited for what's to come with Disappearing Acts. So far, it's good. So,
Okay, well, I'm excited to read it. And of course, not all of our episodes will be this long. It's going to be longer when we cover a literal entire book versus just our chapter chats and our other segments. But we hope that you guys tune in for everything. And we are so excited for the future. Yay.
yay.
Bye.
Bye.